Okay, so now let's talk about what happens in trauma. We get stuck in trauma when we are in situations that are physically, emotionally, and mentally overwhelming. This is usually combined with a sense of extreme isolation and being disconnected from everyone, even when others are present. The feeling of being terrified, trapped, and utterly helpless to escape is ultimately what leads to being traumatized. When this happens, everything gets locked up into that moment exactly the way it happens. All the feelings in that moment get locked in. All of the biological reactions, including the way your body changes, like racing hearts and breathing fast and tension in your muscles, and even nausea can get trapped. At the same time, all the actions you wanted to complete and couldn't, like running away or fighting back, continue to surface anytime you're reminded of the trauma. One of the most important things that gets trapped is the way you think and what you believe about yourself, other people, the world, and God. These beliefs settle in at that moment and remain. The long-term impact of this is we begin to see ourselves as damaged or broken in some kind of way, always in danger, responsible for everything that's negative, and powerless or weak. We begin replaying these beliefs in every situation that comes up until they become really strongly held mindsets we have about ourselves. On top of that, all kinds of other things about that event can get locked up. Things like how old you were, where and when it happened, sight, sound, smells, tastes, even what you were doing. The time of day, season, year, just about anything you can think of all gets frozen in time in that event. All of these things, with all the body sensations, feelings, urges, thoughts, can be reminders or triggers for the trauma. These reminders, they seem to exist everywhere. They begin to invade and interrupt the present moment in lots of ways we don't always understand. When the trauma's over, there's a part of us that wants to get away as fast as possible, never ever think about it again. We can call that part the survivor part. The survivor part wants to get back to living life like everything is normal and the trauma never happened. The main problem is there's still a big part of us that gets left behind, frozen in the moment of the terrible thing. We'll call that part a captive. The captive part keeps trying to tell the survivor part to come back and rescue it and bring it back home with the survivor part. Every time there's a reminder of the trauma, it's like the captive yells out to the survivors, "Hey! I'm still back here in the terrible thing. Come back and get me." The captive keeps yelling, "Danger, danger, danger," because it feels like the terrible thing is still happening. If there were only one trauma to deal with, that would be hard enough. Most people who have one trauma happen always seem to have lots of terrible things happen to them. Sometimes it's the exact same thing over and over again. This leads to more captive parts that get left behind in the same kind of scene as the other captives with their own set of triggers. Sometimes a different kind of terrible thing, and this leads to other captive parts with different locked up feelings and triggers of a different terrible event. These other captives also start calling out to the survivor that they need to be rescued. Eventually, all the triggers and reminders seem to overlap each other, and it's almost impossible to know which trigger goes with which trauma. Maybe we could take a scene from school. And let's say the teacher's talking about something that's a reminder of the trauma and the feelings. And this leads to feeling overwhelmed and frozen and then disconnected. While you're stuck in this, the teacher asks you a question because he sees you aren't paying attention. He has to call your name like 3 times. And by the time you come back to the present moment, everyone in the class is laughing at you. You feel humiliated, embarrassed, and overwhelmed, and you sob and run from the room. How do you feel every time you have to walk back into that classroom? Now that classroom has 2 different events tied to it. One is the teacher is a trigger for the original trauma. And the second is the class itself, because it becomes a different trigger for a different trauma. Now there's two different captives yelling danger at the same time while your survivor part's still trying to pay attention and function in everyday life. It's not hard to imagine how concentration becomes really difficult. Now imagine having this happen nearly every day in some way or another. There would be tons of different captives trying to get your attention in almost every situation you were in. However, the survivor part has to keep trying to go on and live life like everything's normal. The survivor doesn't want to go back to the terrible thing and does everything it can to avoid thinking about it. This leads to a constant battle between the captives trying to remind the survivor of the terrible thing and the survivor fighting to keep the captives quiet. One of the problems with this is that the survivor spends so much energy trying to keep captives quiet, they have a hard time paying attention to other stuff. This creates problems just about everywhere, including work, school, or home. Everyone starts believing the survivor is simply not listening to them or is just lazy. Also makes it pretty hard to make and keep friends. It's pretty exhausting after a while. Sooner or later, the survivor starts running out of energy to keep the captives quiet. At the same time, still doesn't want to go back and deal with the terrible thing again. Lots of times, when the survivor can't deal with it anymore, other parts start to come up and try and help the survivor. Then, when a trigger happens, it can look like an angry part that comes up to keep the survivor from thinking about the terrible thing, and the angry part gets mad enough to break things or hit other people in order not to think about the trauma. This isn't really a survivor or a captive. It's another part that tries to create enough of a distraction so no one else around notices that the survivor is dealing with all these different captives. Sometimes this looks like a part that learns how to go away and just daydream so they don't have to pay attention to anything around them. Sometimes this daydreaming part actually helped get the survivor through the terrible thing while it was happening. This part can even take the survivor to a place where they feel completely numb to everything. And this actually works for a little while until the survivor wants to begin feeling things in life again. Sometimes there's a part that just tries to keep really busy doing things so the survivor doesn't have to think at all. Unfortunately, this part doesn't think things through and will do spontaneous actions without thinking about what might happen as a result. This creates other problems for the survivor. Some of this desire to stay busy is where the high-risk behaviors become in as a way to stay distracted. In general, it's really, really important to remember that all these parts are really trying to help the survivor. Problem is, these parts are creating other problems for the survivor. Sometimes, these parts even create their own trauma that the survivor then has to deal with. The angry part gets in trouble for breaking stuff and hurting others. The daydreaming part gets in trouble for not paying attention or forgetting things. They don't really forget, because they usually didn't hear what was going on in the first place. The busy part gets in trouble when they can't answer the question, "Why'd you do that?" Mostly because they really don't know. Sometimes all the parts just can't seem to help anymore, and the survivor has to find other ways to keep the captives quiet, to avoid thinking about the terrible things. So other distractions like food, alcohol, drugs, anything that can help to avoid the terrible things start to pop up. Just like the other parts that start to develop, this creates even more problems for the survivor. Eventually, the survivor gets to a place where it doesn't know where to start to make things better. Sometimes there's so many bad things that happen to avoid thinking about the original trauma, it's hard to remember what the original trauma was that started it all. All the survivor part knows is that it feels weak, stuck, scared, guilty, and embarrassed. And this happens almost all the time, and nothing seems to help anymore. It doesn't have to get this far, and it absolutely doesn't have to end this way. The survivor part can learn how to get strong and brave enough to go back and rescue the captives. All the locked-in feelings, sensations, and thoughts of the trauma can get worked through and then leave. Then the survivor part doesn't have to forget or avoid the past. It just needs to put the trauma in the past so it doesn't feel like it's still happening in the present moment. The survivor part needs someone to help them get ready to rescue the captive parts. This is usually a therapist who's trained and experienced in trauma work. This therapist can create an environment to help the survivor part feel stronger, more courageous, and have more skills and tools for healing the trauma. Usually, this helps some of the other parts stop coming up as the survivor part gets strong enough not to need those parts anymore. Then the therapist helps the survivor go back and resolve the trauma so the captive parts can come back home. The survivor doesn't have to do this alone anymore, and having a therapist help take them back there gets easier and easier every time they do it. So as we think about this information about what happens in trauma, some of the really important points are: trauma gets stuck or trapped when we are physically, emotionally, or mentally overwhelmed. We always feel isolated and completely alone. In trauma, everything about that moment gets locked up in time. That includes how we think, how we feel about ourselves, and anything that might be connected to the trauma. Once trauma is over, the survivor part wants to get away and never ever look back. The captive parts keep trying to get the survivor part to come rescue them. Multiple traumas can lead to multiple captives yelling at the survivor part at the same time. Different parts can start to take over when the survivor part can't deal with all the captive parts. When the survivors run out of energy to deal with all the parts, this can lead to negative behaviors to distract the survivor part from having to feel the terrible thing. All the problems and parts that form from the original trauma can actually make it hard to remember what the trauma was. A trained therapist can help survivor parts rescue the other parts and find healing in trauma. So now we need to find out what it is we need to do to bring the captives home. Or in other words, what actually heals trauma?